Good evening and greetings of peace. My name is Yusuf Ismail and the program you're watching is I Beg to Differ. This program focuses on contemporaneous debate on socio-economic, political, cultural and religious issues affecting us as South Africans, and certainly looking at some of the global trends in the international community. Today we look at the role of education in this particular country. It seems that over the past 24 years, the status of education has been excessively low to the extent that illiteracy in the rural communities have been at a level never before seen. What is the role and what is the significance of this? More and more parents are in fact introducing the whole concept of homeschooling to their children as they are fed up with the level of schooling and the education standards in our public schools. Well, joining me via Skype from Cape Town to discuss this new phenomenon, I'm joined by Shirley Arwi, who is an activist and also involved in homeschooling, a homeschooling consultant. Welcome, Shirley. It's good to have you.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
Shirley, let's start off with the whole process. Education, the level of education in this country, how would you rate it on a scale of 1 to 10?
Well, judging from reports in the media where, certain skills in children have been assessed by international researchers, South Africa has come up near the bottom in many of those reports. So it looks as though it's really not as good as it should be, as good as parents would like it to be.
I just want to understand this phenomenon because obviously during the heights of apartheid, you had a situation where different race groups had different governing bodies and departments obviously dealing with education to the various racial groups. Now obviously post-1994 there seems to have kind of been a universalism surrounding how education is obviously handled, but it seems to me that the standards have somehow dropped. Is that a correct assessment, or would you possibly see that as superficial? And if indeed the standards have dropped, what is the reason, what's the rationale for this?
I'm not a professional that's involved in assessing the mainstream school system, so I just go on what I read in media reports. But it seems like there are multiple problems, and it's in the implementation, it's the curriculum, it's problems with teacher unions, teacher absenteeism, overcrowded classrooms, a lack of resources, buildings that haven't been built that should have been built. I mean, the media just endlessly reports problems in the education system. So I don't think there's just one reason for the low standards. I think it's a multifaceted problem.
So the alternative you're proposing is homeschooling?
Well, yes, it's an alternative form of education for people who are dissatisfied with the school system. But for many homeschoolers, it's also just they're not choosing it as an alternative. It's something that they want to do. They think it's the right thing to do because they believe that as parents, it's ultimately their role to be in control of their children's education rather than delegating that to the state.
How does it work? How does it work? You go ahead, Shirley. There was a connection problem. I just wanted to know, how does it work? I mean, how does it prepare learners for example, the 21st century workplace? How do you maintain that? Is there some degree of consistency in this?
Well, homeschooling is very innovative, very flexible, very adaptive, and very on the cutting edge of changes in education practices, whereas traditional school systems are actually based on the previous century, and a lot of people say that learners are being pushed through a system that prepares them for being factory workers. Bells ring, you clock in, you clock out, you do as you're told, and everybody gets the same education. Whereas home education enables parents to give their children a customized education and to teach them problem-solving skills and to teach them to think for themselves, which is really crucial in the 21st century where we are having to judge all the information that's out on the media and, think on the spot in a very fast-paced environment.
You see, that's the issue I want to basically unwrap, is when you speak about the element of flexibility, you speak about having a customized education, very much to the needs of the child. But here's the problem. Aren't there certain universals or universal facets within the education system, universally, globally, that is, which a child by necessity has to go through? For example, you may have a situation where parents may choose not to, for example, teach their children mathematics, not to teach their children geography, maybe to just simply focus on literacy skills. How do you maintain, for example, a sort of regulation, a regulatory pattern in the sense that the child, for example, would not lose out in the long term as opposed to going to a conventional schooling, albeit, as you mentioned, it's more like a kind of a very structured, based on the kind of a work format, bell ringing, you go to class, sit down, bell rings, you go for lunch, bell rings, you go home. I accept that it's very much like how the workers were made to work in the 19th century, very much industrial in a large sense. But the point I have is that the kind of flexibility could be a danger at the same time.
Yeah, a lot of people have that kind of concern, but no education teaches everything. So if you look at what the school system teaches, there are gaps, there are skills and things that it doesn't really teach very well. For example, raising a child, it's not just about tending to their academic education. You're raising a whole person. So you have to raise people to be self-confident, to have emotional intelligence, and that needs to be done on a one-on-one basis. In a class of 30 plus children, a teacher can't really focus on those skills. So there are going to be gaps or lacks in any education system. But with homeschooling, most parents choose this option because they are diligent and they really care about their children's well-being, and they want to make sure that the children have all the skills that they need to succeed in adult life. And where they find a problem, they will go on a mission to find a solution for their child's problem. And they're much more motivated and committed to the child than a teacher who just has one child in her class for a year and then that child moves up and becomes somebody else's problem. So in general, although parents may not teach everything there is in the world to know, most of us know from our own experience what skills are required to function successfully in our specific communities as adults. Most of us are pretty diligent at ensuring that our children do develop the skills that they need to an acceptable level.
Okay, Shirley, here's my question I have for you. I understand the point that you've got a situation where you've got one teacher to 30 pupils or one teacher to 60 pupils in many schools. Situation is appalling. It's unacceptable and it's shocking, and government has a significant answer and role to play in respect of the problem we find. Here's the contrary position. The contrary position is that with regards to homeschooling, teaching is a highly sophisticated skill which requires a certain degree of expertise. There's certain qualifications that are basically needed. Many parents have their own particular vocation they're dealing with. How do you instill, or how do we ensure that that level of expertise which is required in teaching as a profession, how does it flow down to parents who may not have that qualification in imparting the necessary information to their children?
It's a good question, and first I want to question the assumption behind it, because what many people believe is that if you are certified, then you are qualified. And you do certainly need to be a trained professional to teach a class of 60 children, to deliver a state curriculum en masse to a large group of children, and to control them in that classroom situation, and to do the required admin and everything that involves classroom teaching. But I'm a parent and I teach my own children. I'm the expert on my children. I've known them since birth. I know their development, their personalities, each one's struggles, each one's talents. And a teacher doesn't have that intimate knowledge of the children. So I feel I'm quite capable, and other homeschooling parents who don't have certificates are quite capable of helping their children learn, because children can actually learn without being taught. We provide them with educational materials, with things that interest them, with things that motivate them. And children learn without actually having professionals teach them. And when it comes to difficult subjects at high school level, for example, if you're not an expert in physics or mathematics or Shakespeare, there are amazing curriculum products that we use. So I bring an expert into my home who teaches my child calculus, there's a teaching DVD, there's a teacher manual, there's answer keys, and the child actually engages in self-study using these materials. And my role is more to be a cheerleader, an encourager, and a supervisor. I don't have to be the expert in calculus or Shakespeare or physical science.
So because you've actually answered a bit of my second question, because that was my issue, is that when you look at subjects like mathematics, physics, and so on, are you saying that there's other, there's kind of self-guide, self-help tools on the computer that basically provides the necessary standards for you to basically engage in sort of self-learning? You're not talking about bringing a private tutor in, would I be correct?
One can private tutor if required. I mean, many parents of school children take their children for extra lessons and give them private tutoring too. So there's nothing stopping homeschooling parents doing the same thing. But generally, homeschooling children do better on average than public school children academically, because they are usually afforded the opportunity to study at their own pace and only move up and progress when they've mastered a particular skill or a particular lesson that they're busy with. Whereas in a classroom, the class moves on and the struggling children have gaps in their understanding, and that foundation causes their later learning to crumble. So, homeschooling is a completely different kind of scenario. As I said, it's customized education, and that's one of the many benefits that it offers.
Shirley, we'll just have to go for a quick ad break. When we're back, I'm going to focus on some of the issues about matriculation, entering university. We'll discuss some of those issues when we're back. We'll be back shortly. Welcome back to I Beg to Differ. I'm your host, Yusuf Ismail, and today we're discussing the contentious issue of homeschooling and certainly looking and exploring at the level and standard of education in South Africa. Shirley, when we went on a break, you basically did, in fact, we focused on some of the subjects where a certain degree of expertise may be required. I'm just curious to know, universities and certainly require a certain degree of qualification, a certain standard if you want to enter a particular field, be it medicine, be it, for example, law, accountancy, whatever the case is. How do we establish a standard? I mean, how does this work? I mean, explain to me. I'm ignorant on the entire field. In your schooling system, there are certain subjects that you, for example, choose. If you, for example, want to further a career in science, if you want to further a career in law for that matter, or in medicine. How does this work with homeschooling? I mean, how are examinations conducted? During the high school period, what subjects are taught? What syllabi do you basically follow? And who determines what the syllabus is?
But there are various options that homeschoolers choose in order to get a recognized school-leaving certificate. If a homeschooler wishes to write the National Senior Certificate, the South African Matric, then they usually have to enroll with the distance education service provider that provides the study materials and does the assessments during the year, and they have to do grades 10, 11 and 12, and then they can write the matric exams. And so, it's the same process as a child in school, except that the learner is doing that study material at home.
Where do they write the exams?
They will write them at the same time of year as the rest of the country writes them. So they normally are done through an examination board, and then they will go to an exam center and sit the matric exams the same as everybody else does.
And from grade 1 right up until grade 6, where do they write the examinations?
There's no need for children to write examinations in the junior school grades. If you think about it, the school system, a teacher has to test children to report back to her seniors, whoever's overseeing her, and she also has to report back to the parents who've delegated the responsibility to her. So she has to test them and send a report. But when I'm homeschooling my own children, I'm seeing their progress on a daily basis. So I know if my child is getting 18 out of 20 for maths, that they're mastering that work pretty well and they can move on. And I know when there's a problem. I know which child is good in languages and which child is good in maths and what their strengths and weaknesses are. So examinations aren't likely to tell me anything that I don't really know about my child and their progress, because I am there on a daily basis watching it. So it's a different scenario. So I don't encourage parents to have their children write exams in the junior school grades. Research has shown that it's unnecessary. It causes a lot of stress for children. But when they get to high school level, certainly then you start coaching them and preparing them to write whichever form of examinations they're going to write. And I only mentioned the South African matric exams, but many homeschoolers actually choose international options as well. Many write the Cambridge examinations, and a lot write American, the GED, and other international matric exams.
So I want to focus on the Cambridge and GED, but just before I get, so are you saying that with the exception of grade, I think grade 12 is matric, with the exception of grade 10, 11, 12, which would have been conventionally standard 8, standard 9, standard 10, that yes, before that, there's no need to write any examination?
Not necessarily, yes, there isn't. For what purpose?
Well, I mean, this is not a concern in the sense that, yeah, certainly there's some degree of satisfaction, but besides obviously preparing them for the final years of their schooling career, doesn't it also mold them in order to show in some sort of regulatory sense that, look, the child is now ready to progress to the next grade or to the next standard?
All right, let me throw this question at you. In our school system, where children are regularly assessed, does it guarantee that they are actually well educated? To me, the answer is no. So assessments are not necessarily guaranteeing a quality of education the way it's being done. But parents are assessing their children daily, and parents want their children to succeed. So they are actually examining their children, just not in a formal exam basis. Sometimes parents do want to have their children tested and assessed by a third party for their own satisfaction. But for example, I'm using top class curriculum products for some subjects, and I know that if my children is mastering that work, then I don't need to have them examined. I'm satisfied that they can move up to the next level and the next level. And many homeschool parents are actually well informed and very concerned about their children's education. So testing generally isn't necessary. That is something that's more required by people in the department who want to fulfill admin requirements, and they see that as a way of controlling what's happening in classrooms.
So does the Department of Education allow that? I mean, we obviously need to look at the legal ramifications. Firstly, because that raises a number of issues. Is homeschooling legal in terms of the present South African dispensation? And does the Department of Education allow the fact that someone, say for example, from grade 5 or grade 6, I don't know what standard 5, standard 6, can now progress to secondary education? Does the Department of Education allow that whole process? Is there not a problem? Does it not come into conflict with the existing Department of Education?
Okay, homeschooling is legal. The South African Schools Act allows for parents to educate their children at home. It doesn't have to be a parent. As long as the child is primarily educated at home, they are being home educated. This is quite a debate. There's new policy that has come out, and last year or the year before there was the Bella Bill published, which hasn't been promulgated yet, which suggests that the government would like to regulate and control and monitor homeschooling much more closely. And this is the crux of the issue. Who should control the educational matters in a child's life? Should it be the state or should it be parents? And obviously, I'm in favor of freedom of choice for parents to choose what their children study and what happens with their child's education. But yes, the answer to the question is the government would like to regulate and monitor and control homeschooling more strictly.
Why would, I mean, do you see that as negative if government wants to get more involved in the education of the child? Do you see that having negative ramifications?
I do. Education is something that's individual and it's a community-based thing. In different areas, what is required to be educated and to function in that community is different. And the government would put people in control of making decisions about individual children who have no knowledge about that actual child and his background and his culture and his community and his family situation. And that would not be in the best interest of each child.
Okay, you mentioned, for example, the Cambridge educational exam that people traditionally write in matric. You also mentioned GED. Now, I just want to query, out of curiosity, GED, as I understand it, I mean, in the United States, traditionally, GED has been the type of education, for example, those that never completed the traditional US homeschooling, the US schooling system, or I don't know if you had the equivalent of the matric or something along that line, end up doing the GED. What is the standard of the GED examination? Because once you pass that, you're not automatically accepted into a university in South Africa. It's not the equivalent, for some reason or the other. It's not similar to the matriculation exemption, or what they call it, the senior certificate. I'm just totally out of touch with education in this country. But as I understand, it's not the equivalent. So how do you get into university? Do you have to now do further tests, SATs? And what guarantee is there that you would necessarily pass those SATs to then progress to university?
All right, they guarantee no matter which matric kind of certificate you have. But the GED is recognized by SAQA in South Africa, and they can issue a certificate of evaluation to a student who has a GED, which states that the closest comparable South African qualification is the National Senior Certificate or an NQF4. And then if a student wants to study for a diploma or a higher certificate at a college or university, a GED alone or a matric without exemption is usually quite adequate for admission, provided that the student meets any other admission requirements that are needed for that particular course of study. For exemption purposes, USAF also recognizes the GED as being a foreign grade 12 equivalent, but there are additional requirements that a student must meet in order to qualify for exemption. Until the end of 2019, a student can do the GED, for example, and then write the American SATs, which are American College Entrance Tests, and then they can apply for foreign conditional exemption. But USAF is going to discontinue that option in 2020. And thereafter, the next best way for a homeschooler child to get exemption would be to follow the GED, NQF4, with an NQF5 course, such as a higher certificate course at a college, which is a career-oriented course.
So
when you have an NQF5, you are then eligible for complete exemption.
So could you then get into university?
To be accepted for tertiary study, and online universities are also always an option.
Shirley, could you then, for example, with the GED education, then say you want to do medicine for that matter, or law, having completed that and then writing the SATs, could you then do those necessary, I understand medicine, for example, may be a bit of a pushing it too far, because even with matriculation and with 6 distinctions, it's difficult to get into university. But let's say law, commerce, is it possible to get into university with that?
I always say parents and students must check the requirements, because each faculty at each university has its own requirements. So in general, a matric with exemption or a GED with exemption is the minimum requirement for admission to university, but different faculties have further additional requirements. So you need to check on that. But we have had many students already accepted to various universities for a range of different degrees.
Okay, well, Shirley, we're going to have to go again for a quick ad break, pay our bills, and we'll see you soon. Well, welcome back to I Beg to Differ, and we're discussing and debating the pros and cons of homeschooling and versus traditional schooling. And with me, joining me via Skype from Cape Town, is Shirley Erwi, who is a homeschooling consultant, a parent, and an activist. Shirley, just before we went for the break, we focused on the kind of some of the technical trajectories that one can possibly follow in terms of how one gets into university. I just want to focus on something which is that integration. we talk about things like socialization, social cohesion in the South African diaspora. Doesn't homeschooling, in fact, when it comes to development, and we talk about growing up, and certainly you would have gone through that, I would have gone through it. When you grow up, you go to school, you get exposed to everything. We went through bullying. We went through, for example, I remember school fights. Boyard in the school ground scrums, and for example, going to the teachers, getting sometimes 6 of the best. Doing things which children would normally do, but getting to at the same time know people, know different individuals, making friends, sometimes obviously making enemies. All that was viewed as, conventionally part of a child's development process, which would hopefully subsequently mold him to either be a better human being, teaching him some of the challenges in life, teaching him that life, for example, can be unfair at times, that we don't live in an egalitarian society, that there are ups and downs, that we're going to face these constant challenges. How does homeschooling contribute to that kind of social cohesion? We understand, obviously, the problems now in our schools with drugs and some of the worst vices we've never seen before. But that whole process which we went through, shouldn't that be a necessity, a necessary part of a child's development? In terms of molding him into a better human being, which would be then lacking if someone is just simply stuck at home, occasionally goes out with the mom and dad, but doesn't actually interact with children of his age at a young age.
The perception is that homeschooling isolates children and keeps them in a cocoon, but in fact, the classroom does that. It keeps children with one age group, their peer group, in a classroom scenario. So I don't keep my children in a classroom. I give them the world as their classroom. So homeschool children are free to interact with people of all ages in the community and in society. They're not just isolated at home. And even at home, there are multiple age groups in a family if there's more than one child. And the research shows that children learn their social skills best from their parents. When you send children to a classroom, they are usually corrupted by their peer group, who are also untrained because they're not being taught the values and the emotional and social skills by their parents. They're learning it in the dog-eat-dog world of the jungle of the classroom, like you say, the bullying and the naughtiness and the influence that peers have on each other.
What about things, for example, like participation in plays, participation, for example, in sports? When you part, for example, when you're part of a school, and I understand, depending on which school you obviously attend to, but sometimes you obviously participate at sports, you can get the opportunity to participate at sports at the highest level, engage in theatre, possibly excursions, depending, of course, on the school that you attend. That would be lacking at home, unless, of course, the parent pays now for a sports club to enter the child. But how do you juggle that in a daily routine where the parent's job may not be a teacher, unless, of course, someone's a housewife, but say you've got 2 parents working. How would you be able to juggle, and they want to choose homeschooling? How will that be logistically feasible in the long run?
Sport is definitely possible, and homeschoolers have achieved amazing things in sport because they're not confined to the classroom for half the day. They are able to be more flexible with their school time, and we've got many of them that are national champions in various sports. With parents, generally there's one parent working full-time, and very often the other parent either works from home, freelance or part-time, and that is how they manage to juggle the home education. So I can only use myself as an example. I have some online businesses and do consulting, but we focus on school time during the morning, just like others children do. And then my children go to sport in the afternoon, and I do work at night. I work in between it during the daytime. It is a juggle, but when you're committed to doing something, you find a way to make it work.
How long does homeschooling take? Did you get them up, for example, at 6 o'clock, brush their teeth, eat their breakfast? How do you go about doing it?
Okay, there's a range of different styles of homeschooling in our community, but in my family, we are quite relaxed. We don't get up at 6:30 to be at school. I rebel against that because I hated it in my own schooling. So we start later in the morning at about 8:30 or 9. Everyone's downstairs in our room where their schoolwork is. And then they do formal learning activities for about 2 to 3 hours, which includes some time where I also read aloud to them because we have a literature-based approach in our home. We learn social studies by reading stories rather than textbooks. And we can be flexible, so we don't have homework scheduled, but if somebody needs to do work in the afternoon or wants to do something online or wants to do something in the evening, homeschoolers, can work at any time that suits the family.
So there's no homework. There's no homework. There's no homework for the kids.
No, because we get everything done within the designated time in the morning. We generally homeschool about 3 hours a day, and we get enough done during that time.
I don't want to probe into your personal life, but I mean, why I'm raising it as an example to kind of give us a practical demonstration of what it entails. Would you, for example, say have for half an hour mathematics? Would you then have, for example, English? Would you have, Afrikaans or geography or physics? How would you kind of split the time? How would you do that? Would you say, now you've done this, now it's a break? How would you do that?
Okay, we don't have structured lessons with bells ringing like school. I mean, we do not replicate the school system at home. But in my home, because I've got multiple children that I'm homeschooling, I do give each of them a daily schedule where work is set out that they can get on with pretty much on their own. If they need help, then they can ask me, so that they can get on and do things while I'm busy with another child or busy with my own work, if I'm answering emails or on a phone call, because I am working from home as well. So there is some structure. But as I say, we're flexible, if something interrupts us or we need to go somewhere, then we catch up another day. We can be much more flexible than...
So it's very much like, for example, the child then also teaches himself, because that's also the other issue, and my concern is that I know the challenges, the pitfalls that we had and that are existing in schools, but every lesson, for example, you've got different teachers coming in, and for the duration of, say, 45 minutes, you've got the teacher, okay, maybe he may not be giving individual attention to a child, but collectively for, at least if he's a good teacher, for about 45 minutes, he's busy actually teaching, writing on the chalkboard. If, for example, it is an English lesson, they're going through the material completely with the child. If it's geography, physics, science, they're going through it for the full duration. Now, whether the child picks up or not, that's another debate entirely. But the problem is that you've got something which is structured. Now, from your perspective, and generally it seems to be the trend, is that when it comes to homeschooling, it's very much unstructured, but if you've got different youths and youngsters and children from different age groups, you then can't give the full attention. Now, in a conventional schooling setup, whilst there may not be individual attention, but collectively, for the full duration of the hour, there's some form of teaching goes on. You can't within the homeschooling environment ensure that because of the flexibility of the entire process. So my question is, from that perspective then, can that not be seen as an inherent disadvantage?
Not at all, because homeschooling is not school at home. So it doesn't look like school at home. Children don't have to learn in the same way as children do in a classroom. Children through homeschooling can learn math skills, for example, by running a business, by playing Monopoly, by doing a page in a workbook, but it doesn't have to look like school. And you see, it's a bit of a mind shift because all of us have been through probably 12 years of schooling, and that's what we've been trained to think of as education. It's a teacher delivering information into the minds of children like a bucket that you're filling.
Yes, exactly. I mean, because I think we conscientize. I believe you yourself, we conscientize, so anything outside that ambit is viewed as bizarre to us. Just before we go for a break, how long has homeschooling been around? Because it seems to me, or maybe we can deal with it when we come back, but just quickly, how long has it been around in the South African? Is this a new phenomenon, or has it been around for some time?
Well, essentially, parental education has been here for centuries. It's always been in existence. Sure. But if you look at it narrowly as homeschooling, where parents are taking control of academic education, then it's actually only been legal since 1996, when laws were passed allowing for homeschooling in South Africa.
Okay. Well, we're going to look at some of these laws. We're going to unpack some of these laws when we're back. And I also want to bring in government's role in this, and why there's so much of animosity and hostility towards us. But we'll discuss that when we're back as we continue this debate. Welcome back to I Beg to Differ, and we've been spending the last 40 minutes debating the pros and cons of homeschooling and certainly education in general in this country. Shirley, just when we went for a break, I think I need to raise this here. There's a lot of hostility that government, the Department of Education, the state in general has towards homeschooling. Now, you know, I won't say that there's, you know, if we want to talk about a kind of a conspiracy, I don't think this particular government is that intuitive enough or knowledgeable enough. Their concern seems to be with other forms of self-aggrandizement and income generating sources. Why is there so much of hostility from the state towards homeschooling? What's a deeper dilemma that the state faces?
Well, for the homeschooling parent, the question is, why should the state have control over the education of all children in South Africa? We do recognize that every child has the right to receive education. That is in our constitution. And the government does have a responsibility to ensure that that right is realized. And where parents choose to put the children in the state school system, then the state doesn't have an obligation to provide a good quality of education. But the question that homeschooling parents ask is, why are they interfering with homeschooling when in general the homeschooling community are doing a very good job of educating their children because they're committed and they're caring and they have their children's long-term best interests at heart? Why is there new policy and regulations coming out suggesting that parents must be monitored and controlled by government officials? Because the only way government officials know how to monitor and regulate is by assessing children on the CAPS-based system that's used in the schools. But where children are using a different curriculum, that's going to give them, it's going to be an unfair situation. And so it looks to homeschoolers.
What curriculum are you using? Shirley,
one size fits all education.
What curriculum? I'm just curious to know, what curriculum would you suggest would be the best?
I don't say it is the best, because buying a curriculum is like telling parents there's only one kind of car for your family. Every family has different needs. Every car gets you from A to B, and there are many curricula out there that will serve the purpose of getting your child from uneducated or unskilled in a subject to becoming skilled in a subject. But the type of program will suit the needs and personality and learning style and budget of a family.
So are you saying then that there's a fear or a kind of a paranoia from the state that children are not getting the necessary education via homeschooling? But I mean, the problem I have is that I work certainly in the legal field, in the rural communities. I deal with accused on a daily basis, a lot of them minors. A lot of them go through what we would traditionally call the Bantu education. Now, obviously, it's transmogrified. But a lot of these children that come out of these schools in the rural areas cannot read a basic word of English, cannot speak English, although they've completed matric. Now, my issue is that if there is this kind of concern towards homeschooling, I mean, on the basis that they're not getting the necessary skills or the educational know-how, then there would be an equal concern to the level of education, for example, in the rural communities or in public schools in general. But there doesn't seem to be that kind of concern. So my question again is that, is there kind of a deeper dilemma that government has beyond just simply the issue of whether children have skills? Does a control or regulation at its fundamental core amount to in fact dictating what children can or cannot do? Because it doesn't seem to be skills. Because if it was skills, there would be concern about the level of education in the general conventional school, which is appalling, to say the least. But the problem I have is then why so much of concern towards homeschooling?
Well, exactly. I see that. And the question is, if they're not concerned about skills, then it looks more like it's about controlling what people think, about controlling the voters that are going to vote for them and keep them in power, and controlling the taxpayers who are going to give the money.
So it's a kind of that's interesting. You pointed that out. So it seems to be that there's some sort of political agenda at a fundamental level, and maybe this may be the case that, and I see this, traveling through rural areas, that a lot of these schools, for example, you've seen these massive boards promoting, for example, the values of the ANC, if you could call them values in any event. It seems to be that a lot of it is, in fact, politically motivated, that at the end of the day, they want lemmings who want to sustain the existing political dispensation and not allow a society of free thinkers, which may at a fundamental level be a threat to government and a challenge to government.
Well, there are quotes that have been said by government officials. I don't have the names with me right now, but I remember the one guy said that education is a political game. And there was another one where it was a trade union leader of a teachers union, and he was talking about, the children are cadres and they must be indoctrinated to think the way they want. And there's other sort of propaganda out there that we are raising a certain South African citizen. So it implies that they're wanting to give a kind of a thinking to the children through the schools.
That's something that raises a number of alarm bells, although I've seen a few, but that's possibly because I went to these areas. In Nazi Germany, for example, you had a clear case of not covert, but overt political indoctrination taking place. The same thing was in Stalinist Russia. People don't talk about it now because they assume that everything is fine after 24 years of democracy. But at a deeper level, and I've seen this, we do outreaches on behalf of the legal entity that I'm based with, and I've seen at a very covert level, particularly in the rural communities, some degree of covert political indoctrination where you've got these political party members going to schools and brainwashing children at a young age, which you may not necessarily see in many of the city-run schools or the public schools in the major areas of South Africa. So that seems to be happening at a fundamental level, and people are not even talking about that.
Well, I'm in the rural area, so I don't know about that, but I do know that parents just feel they want to have control of what their children learn. And I think it's a parent's right, because we are responsible for teaching our children not just academics and political stuff, but it's also about raising children with character and teaching them moral values. And that's what homeschooling parents are concerned about.
If one were to compare, for example, your homeschooling with private schoolings, looking at a school like Paarl Gymnasium, or in Durban, Michael House, or Maritzburg College, what would you see as the essential difference? Would private schooling not be the alternative? Of course, it's extremely expensive. The average South African cannot afford it. But shouldn't that be the type of education that schools in general in South Africa should basically, reach out to? That's the kind of education that we would want. The type of education that is there in private schools. I've never been to a private school, but from what I've heard, I can only assume that there is a certain standard, even via the Independent Examination Board for a number of years. I'm not so sure if they're in place, but that's a kind of standard that we should be reaching out to in terms of the level, which is generally a conventional school, but with a certain higher standard.
Certain schools are achieving high standards of academics, but one of the problems that I have personally is that the government is also forcing independent schools to follow the national curriculum. So essentially you're getting government education on steroids, as one homeschooling dad put it. You're paying a lot of money, but the content is still dictated by the state.
Yeah.
And why should the state control what we think, what we believe, and what we learn? Okay. There's so much to learn out there beyond what's in the in the national curriculum. Why can't we have diversity in South Africa? Okay. Why can't independent schools choose their own curriculum too? But I know what the reason is, because I've heard, educational ministers say they basically want a one-size-fits-all. We must all come down to the same level. And so that is a political agenda.
Sure. This is one other question that I've gotten, and speaking about the rural communities and speaking about the vast majority in South Africa, when we talk about homeschooling, and I think this needs to go to the root, is that it's very much of a niche, and what I say, maybe a niche that can be sustained by possibly the middle or the upper class. But the vast majority of people in this country, South Africans in general, you look at the average individual in the township, for example, the masses. Education, we know, is at a poor standard. But a lot of these people, rural folk, for example, won't be able to engage in homeschooling. The parents themselves are illiterate. They cannot read or write. They don't have the know-how. A lot of them, for them, it's essentially a battle for survival. And in fact, schooling, going to a normal conventional school, albeit be in a poor state, is an inevitability for them. So it seems to me that at the end of the day, when we talk about homeschooling as an alternative, it's very much something which is limited to the upper middle class, those who can afford it, those who can sustain it. Because if you look at some of these fees, even when you talk about Cambridge education, extremely exorbitant for the average person to in fact afford. But the vast majority, certainly there may be, the benefits that you basically exhibit out of homeschooling will not be able to flow down to them because the parents certainly are in no capacity to engage in homeschooling.
In an ideal world, I think that even poor people can homeschool their children. I just look at the townships and I think there are so many unemployed people, but if they are literate at least, then they can help each other and help one another's children. And if there was access to some learning materials, good libraries that were provided perhaps, at least, you don't need to be in a school system to be able to learn. And the learning needs of different communities differ. So in a rural area, it's a skill to know how to herd your father's cattle and how to care for them, because that is your family's wealth. That is what you require in that economy. In a city environment, it works differently. We need to know how to earn money and get a job or start a business or whatever. And the education system needs to respect that. When you take a rural person out of that community and all the skills they got there work, and you put them in a different community, then perhaps it's not going to work so effectively. But we need to respect that education in different communities may look different. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
So would this be egalitarian in the long term? In our South African situation, because we're not living in an ideal world, this would be possibly ideal in maybe the first world in a general sense, but in the South African situation, it would be probably a minority of people that would be able to engage in this type of education.
Well, homeschooling is growing fast, so it's growing across all racial groups. It's growing in all areas across the country. So we'll see how it goes and what's going to happen.
Sure.
But definitely parents want an alternative to the school system because it just isn't working as effectively as they would like it to.
Shirley, if there's one thing, we have to wrap up, if there's one message you'd like to send out to the parents, and certainly we're going to have teachers listening in, if there's one message you'd like to send out to them, taking into account the realities of this country and in line of the issue of homeschooling and what you've certainly elaborated on for the past hour, can you give us that message in 20 seconds, 30 seconds?
Yeah, parents are the experts on their own children, and we are teaching children, not subjects. And that's why I believe that every parent who wants to do it, you can do it.
Thank you, Shirley Uri. It's been a pleasure having you on this program. We hope to have more further engagements, debates, and discussions with you. And to you folks out there, we'll leave it to you to decide whether you intend engaging in homeschooling or conventional schooling. The program you're watching is I Beg to Differ. This is a program which focuses on contemporaneous debate on any topic and any issue that we would like to discuss, getting down to the bottom of the story. My name is Yusuf Ismail. Join us next week for more hard-hitting debate on I Beg to Differ. Till then, greetings of peace and have a good evening.